All morning I've waited for peace and quiet, and now there's a helicopter. Oh! Oh, it's a train. Right, I'm just going to crack on because, to be honest, the helicopter and a train aren't my only sound problems. For instance, as you can probably hear, there's quite an echo in this room. That's because furniture, it turns out, takes longer to build than actual buildings. Also, as you might be able to hear, there's an unfinished building outside of that window, and there's builders there all day playing rubbish radio and drilling. And to top it all off, this morning outside of that window, there was a big Brexit protest, which I don't really have any opposition to, but they all had really loud whistles. So yeah, I've been waiting to do this video all morning. But anyway, I moved here last week. Welcome to Manchester. I mean, I'm in Manchester, you're probably not, but I'm very excited to be here. I feel sort of quite inspired. I've got a bit of a new lease of creative life, so I'm looking forward to getting down to creating lots more photos, lots more videos. That's it, I think, actually, to be honest, photos and videos. But yeah, it's been a little while since I made a video. I didn't intend to have a gap at all while I moved and was doing this commercial work. One of the problems was that I did intend to do a whole video about panoramas. So I went up a Welsh mountain at sunset a few weeks back, and I wanted to film the whole video up there. So I was going to get loads of pretty B-roll of like all the nice sky and colours. I was going to go through all the tips and tricks that I use to create good panoramas and finish off with creating my own really good panoramas that I was really pleased with. Problem was that within about 30 seconds of getting up the mountain, yeah, and you're probably thinking, James, that is a little puddle. Why on earth would that stop you filming a video? The water was so yeah, after getting my feet wet, I wasn't really, like in the mood to finish a video. So fast forward a few weeks and I've not made anything for a while. So here goes. Panoramas, unfortunately, still aren't as easy to make on a good camera as they are on an iPhone. Not saying an iPhone's not a good camera, but you know what I mean. With an iPhone, you do this. And with a normal camera, you still need to jump through a fair few more hoops than that. So this video is just going to be a summary of the hoops that I jumped through to get half-decent panoramas. And by half-decent panoramas, I don't mean these ones that I got up that mountain. You have to take into account I did have car alarm. And these panoramas are probably the sort of thing you would get if you had very wet, very cold feet, and you couldn't concentrate on your composition. Anyway, provided you use these 10 tips and you have dry feet, you should get really good shots. Number 1, use manual exposure. Now, actually, I don't know why I feel the need to pick up a camera every time I'm going to do a camera tip that involves a camera setting. I mean, you know what a camera looks like. Now, manual exposure is important with a panorama because a panorama is obviously made up of lots of different photos. That means that if you don't use a manual exposure, each time you move your camera to get the images for the panorama, your camera will try and work out what exposure it needs, and it may be different to the last photo it took or the next photo it's going to take. And that just means you're going to create lots of work for yourself in post. Some of your images in the panorama might end up more noisy than others, even if you can correct the exposure in post. And you might be thinking, well, how do I get my exposure? How do I work out what my exposure needs to be? Because I'm going from somewhere like over here to somewhere over here. So what do I use to work out what my exposure should be? And there's probably a few different answers to that. What I do is go straight down the middle. I want to make sure that the middle of my panorama at least has got the exact right exposure. The other thing I do, which is my second tip, sometimes when you're making a panorama, because you're going across a really wide scene, you could have a cave on one side of the scene and the full sun on the other side. And if you don't bracket, it's quite difficult to get a good exposure for both the really dark, deep shadows and the really light, high highlights. So yeah, I bracket by 3 stops for each of the shots I need for a panorama. So if my panorama is made up of 10 images, it's actually made up of 30 images because I take 3 images at each stage. Still with me? What's that now? Tip number 3, shoot in manual focus for exactly the same reason that you choose manual exposure. You don't want your camera selecting a different focus point every time you move your camera, otherwise your panorama will just be a mess. Also try and choose an aperture somewhere between f8 and f11. That way you'll have a really, really nice sharp image and most of the frame will be in focus in most instances. Tip number 4, is to use a tripod. Now, it can be quite tempting sometimes when you're making a panorama to just hold your camera up like this and just shoot across the frame and then stitch it all together in post. The trouble with doing that is that you don't always end up with a flat camera right the way across the frame. And when you don't end up with a flat camera, if you're at an angle, if you're inconsistent with how high the camera is through the panorama, you're going to end up having to do lots of cropping in post, which just means you're missing out on detail. And if you use a tripod, well, you should minimize that. Step number 5 is what's to do with the tripod again. It's basically to use a tripod properly. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you're taking a normal photo with a tripod, the most important thing is to make sure that the camera is straight. So if the camera is straight, the tripod doesn't necessarily need to be straight. So that camera right now is pretty straight. As you can see, the tripod's not straight, which means that you're not going to be optimally stabilized because the tripod isn't as stable as it would be if the tripod was straight. Doesn't always matter for the end result though, because if you've not got a super slow shutter speed and it's not really windy, your tripod's probably still not going to blow over and it'll do its job. However, if you shoot a panorama without a straight tripod, your camera isn't going to remain straight through all of the shots that you need to get for that panorama, which means that you need to be 100% sure your tripod is level as well as your camera. Now that's quite easy to do on a tripod like this because there's a spirit level on top of one of the legs, so I can just adjust the legs accordingly until the bubble is right in the middle of that spirit level. If you haven't got one of those, you need to do it a little bit more by eye or just by a spirit level that you can stick on top of the tripod leg, or one of them. Tip number 6 is to shoot portrait. Now you can shoot landscape when you're doing panoramas, and you can do it in less shots, which can be appealing sometimes. But if you shoot portrait, you can zoom in more, and therefore you can get much more detail. I mean, if you're stitching images together anyway, you might as well get as much detail as you possibly can. So I always shoot portrait, even though you need to do it over a lot more frames. Tip number 7 is that every time you move your camera, it needs to be by about 1/3 of a frame. Now the point of leaving 1/3 of overlap for every time you move the camera is that it allows the software to stitch the photos together more accurately. Or if the software fails, you've got more information to work with to stitch the images together yourself. Tip number 8. When you get into Lightroom, make your profile corrections, and then for each of the stacks of 3 images that you've created, make each one of them a HDR image. Tip number 9 is more sort of steps than tips now. When you've got all of your HDR images, go back to photo merge and make a panorama out of all of them. And tip number 10 is well, it's a tip and a step. So it's a stip. When you've got your panorama and you've done any cropping or boundary warping that you need to do, which you shouldn't have to actually if you used a tripod correctly, when you've got your panorama, you'll probably be tempted to move the sliders across in Lightroom to see what you can do in post like you would any other photo. And I would urge you to not do that as much as you do in other photos. And that's because, like I said before, in a lot of panoramas, you're going to have really, really dark darks and really light lights across the scene because you've got such a big scene. Now, when you move those sliders, you're affecting all of the highlights or all of the shadows at the same time. And you probably don't want to treat all the highlights and all the shadows the same across such a huge scene. What I would suggest is that rather than making global changes, more often than not with panoramas you want to make local changes. So you want to take your time, get a brush and just make tweaks in the parts of the image that you want to make those tweaks in. And you should get a better result than if you just work with the sliders. And to be honest, that stands for all images. But yeah, most people haven't got the time to brush around individual images. So yeah, that's my 10 tips. Like I said before, if you employ all of them and keep your feet dry, you'll probably get some really good results. Until the next time, I'm going to go and put some earplugs in. Cheers.